With the 5-year anniversary coming soon, a standard 5-star could be chosen for free, which of course includes Keqing, who I've mained for 3 years. Therefore, I cannot find a better opportunity to make a video on her to hopefully explain her builds and playstyles for those who wish to choose her in the upcoming event, or those who are interested in Keqing already. To give an idea on what I'll cover, for those who want a basic info delivered in a concise manner, I will explain her abilities and constellations, then I'll talk about her best weapons and artifacts, and finally I'll talk about her team comps and rotations. Then for those who want an in-depth explanation, I will then cover some extra details that you might be interested in, such as Kazuha vs Sucrose, diminishing returns on EM or attack sands, and some other niche and fun teams. Also note that this video will be mainly focused on Electro Keqing. With all that being said, let's start with the abilities section. Keqing is one of the characters which all her abilities, i.e. her normal attack, E and Q, are all used in a rotation. Firstly, her normal attack has 5 hits, although normally after 1 hit you perform a charge attack in most rotations. Her charge attack scaling is not bad considering its short animation time, but it consumes 25 stamina. Next, her E throws a lightning stiletto towards the nearest enemy, which deals electro damage. You have 2 options, either you recast E or do a charge attack. Recasting E will give you 5 seconds of electro infusion that could be overridden by certain abilities such as Bennett's Q, and charge attack will make her do a thunderclap slash at the stiletto's location. Note that after triggering the thunderclap slash by the charge attack will not give you the electro infusion. Her Q does 1 initial hit followed by 8 slashes and then a final hit. In most teams, especially quickswap teams, her Q is a significant source of damage. Her energy cost is 40, so her energy requirements are not quite high. An important thing to note is that if you Q immediately after your E, the stiletto will not disappear yet after the Q animation finishes. Finally, on her Ascension passives, her Ascension 1 passive gives her 5 seconds of electro infusion after recasting her E, and her Ascension 4 passive gives you 15% crit rate and energy recharge after pressing Q. Note that the buff timer starts the moment Q is pressed, so you'll only have 4 to 5 seconds left of buff after your Q animation ends. For Aggravate Keqing, you want to prioritize getting her to level 90 and then level up her normal attacks and then Q, and lastly her skill. For Quickswap Keqing, you want to level up her Q and then her E and lastly her normal attacks. And lastly, for physical Keqing, only leveling up NA is enough, so you can leave her E and Q at around level 6. This is the more unfortunate part about Keqing's kit. Her C1 gives an effect in which recasting E gives an additional attack that shares the same ICD with skill, dealing 50% attack as damage. This is unfortunately an insignificant increase in damage, only being 1 to 2% more damage than C0. When normal attack or charge attack hits opponents affected by Electro, C2 gives a 50% chance to produce an Electro particle. This might further lower ER requirements for other Electro units in the team. Her C3 and C5 further increases the level of her Q and E by 3 respectively. Her C4 increases attack by 25% after triggering an Electro-related reaction. This is useful when using weapons like Mistsplitter or Haran with high base attack, or when you are using EM Sands and have low attack. Her C6 allows you to get 6% electro damage when using normal attack, charge attack, E or Q, which the timers are independent of each other. So you basically get 18 to 24% free electro damage from this constellation. Certainly it is a good thing to have, but as a C6 of a 5-star is kind of lackluster. This is the more interesting part of the video. Assuming that you want to play Keqing in a reaction team, there are a few options to choose from. Firstly, there's the best set for Electro Keqing generally, which is Thundering Fury 4-piece, giving 15% electro damage from the 2-piece and electro-related reaction damage buffs from the 4-piece. This set also allows the CD of the second E in the rotation to be reduced, allowing for more flexible and comfortable rotations. There are a few to choose from if you think Thundering Fury domain is inefficient, including 4-piece Thundersuver if you are playing Mono Electro or Reactions Keqing, as these teams can keep the enemy affected by Electro, so the buff from the 4-piece can have high uptime. You can also choose 4-piece Gilded Dreams if you are playing Aggravate or Electro Charged Keqing, but note that attack stance is noticeably better than EM because of the diminishing returns. You can also choose various 2-piece of attack and EM. Finally, you could also use 4-piece Shimenawa for Electro Charge Keqing, as her burst is not that useful here, and in fact is often a loss of overall damage if you use Xingqiu or Yelan. The best weapon for Keqing is undoubtedly Mist-Splitter due to its high base attack, crit damage secondary stat, and an accessible passive that gives a lot of damage %. Then you have Primordial Jade Cutter due to its very high 44.1% crit rate secondary stat. It does not fall behind Mist-Splitter by a lot and is very viable with a slight attack buff of around 200 from the weapon passive depending on the build. All 5-star crit weapons are fine to use as stat sticks, such as Light of Foliar Incision and Haran. For Haran, you might even use N2C combos because of the NA buff from the weapon passive to use up less stamina for similar damage. For 4-star options, the Lion's Roar is one of the best options out there due to the sustainable passive giving 20% damage at R1, only requiring Electro application on the enemy, hence best suited for Aggravator and Electro Charge teams, and is very viable even at R1. The Blackcliff Longsword is also a usable stat stick, providing a high base attack of 565 in 4-star swords, and also a useful crit damage substat, costing 34 stock glitter to buy. However, it's often worse off than Lion's Roar, so if you have an unused Lion's Roar, you can also use it. For more free-to-play friendly options, Calamity of Issue is a very strong free option, though being event limited. The only requirement for using this is using a character that shields, such as Kirara and Zhongli, arguably Baizhu, but his shield is relatively weak. Nonetheless, it still provides attack %, which a lot of Keqing builds on EM Sense lack, a 40% damage buff for normal and charge attacks, and a 16% crit rate buff. R5 Harbinger of Dawn is also a surprisingly good alternative to R1 Lion's Roar if you have a shield to activate its passive. Despite its low base attack, the secondary crit damage, the crit rate from the passive, and its high accessibility hugely justifies it as a free-to-play starting option, as you can easily get a lot from wishes. For other 4-stars, if you have a high refinement Iron Sting sitting in your inventory, you can also use that as the EM secondary stat, and the damage % from its passive is greatly appreciated in aggravate Keqing teams. Also, there is Tokubo Shigure from 3.3 event, which its passive gives a 10-second damage % buff towards a single enemy and also has the EM secondary stat. If somehow none of these options are available, the Dark Iron Sword could technically be a very early starter weapon. Firstly, I'll talk about the most common team of Keqing, which is of course Aggravate. The typical team comp consists of Keqing, Fischl, a Dendro slot, and a flexible slot. For the Dendro slot, typically you would want to put Nahida here because of her huge EM buff and AoE Dendro application, but for most people, a team without any shields and healing is not comfortable to use, especially when you don't have Zhongli. If you want to use Nahida, you could use Prototype Amber to provide some healing. You could also choose Yao Yao or Baizhu to sustain and use Noblesse or Instructor on them. A good rule of thumb is to choose Noblesse if your Keqing uses EM Sands, and to use Instructor if you use Attack Sands. For a more offensive option, you could use Kole or DMC, with them using Fav, and also Instructor or Noblesse. Note that DMC has a rather high energy cost of 80, so ER is also important in DMC builds. For the Electro slot, in terms of damage, Fischl is the best teammate for Keqing, as Fischl's A4 allows her to deal additional damage when an Electro-related reaction is triggered. Additionally, if you have Fischl's C6, then Keqing's frequent attacks can also proc the coordinated attacks from C6. In fact, more than 40% of the damage dealt in the Keqing Fischl Aggravate team is from Fischl. If you want the Electro slot to instead provide buffs or survivability, Beidou, Sara, and Kuki are good options, especially if you have Beidou C6, which shreds Electro res, and Sara's C6, which buffs crit damage on Electro hits by 60%. Note that high investment C6 Sara teams, such as Keqing builds with over 240 crit damage, an attack circlet might beat a crit damage circlet if you're using EM Sands, and an EM circlet might also beat a crit damage circlet if you're using attack Sands. Finally, the flex slot could be Kazuha for his strong grouping, damage buff, and VV shred. Similarly, Sucrose, especially at C6, is a strong contender too, especially with her EM buffs that aggravate teams greatly appreciate. Lynette is also a strong option as she provides a 16% attack buff. For survivability, you can run Lan Yan as she shields and also has access to VV, or Zhongli who has 20% resistance shred and also could use 4-piece tenacity. Shilonen performs similarly to Kazuha as she can fully utilize 4-piece scroll, which gives 40% damage bonus, along with 36% rest red at level 10E and healing from her Q. An added bonus is that her rest red does not require you to trigger Electro Crystallize to be activated, so you would not have to worry about Nahita's strong 1.5U Dendro application taking up all the Electro applied on the enemy, which would occur in a team with Kazuha and Nahita. Note that Shilonen has no grouping, so Kazuha might be better against multiple waves of enemies. Next, I'll talk about the composition of a Keqing Taser team. Generally, this team involves Keqing, a Hydro slot, an Animal slot, and a Flex slot. For the Hydro slot, you can use Xingqiu, which has interruption resistance from his rain swords, high Hydro application, and slight healing. Also, you could use Yelan, which gives a damage buff to your own field character along with very high personal damage. Both C6 Xingqiu and Yelan are usable, and I'll not address the debate between them two here. Rather, it's important to decide whether you want the interruption resistance from Xingqiu or the damage from Yelan and choose your preference. Also, Farina is a great option, providing high personal damage. However, be aware that her HP draining will be an issue if you don't have a healer, and that her personal energy regeneration is not sufficient to self-sustain her burst at low ER. You generally would want her and another teammate to use Favonius to resolve her energy issues. You could also use Kokomi with Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers as sustain and buffer as attack buffs benefits Keqing, especially when Keqing is built heavily on EM. For the animal slot, it's again either Kazuha, Sucrose or Lanyan. However, Lanyan's skills are mainly on field, which means that she won't trigger Electro Charge off field, which makes Kazuha and Sucrose slightly more beneficial. Note that Geo characters are less recommended due to them triggering Crystallize and messing up the elements applied on the enemies. Just as a side note, if you're using Farina, Jean can reliably use the burst to stack a lot of fanfare at the beginning of the rotation, and her continuous healing could also negate the effects of the HP drain from Farina. The Jean Farina core brings healing, damage buff, higher field damage, and VB shred, and is seen relatively frequently. Finally, for the flex slot, you could also use another Hydro character like Xingqiu or Yelan, as a Xingqiu Yelan or a Yelan Farina combo does significant damage. You can use Fischl for additional damage as again Taser Keqing triggers her A4 a lot. Similarly, Beidou could also be used as a shielder and provide some off-field damage. Also, Inefa is a very strong contender for the flex slot as she shields, gives EM buff through her Q, and provides access to Lunar Charged. Lunar Charged Keqing teams are surprisingly strong, especially with the buffs to Electro Charge and Lunar Charge in 528 Abyss, and in fact I've also used the Lunar Charge Keqing team to clear this Abyss. Next up is a Quick Bloom team. It consists of Keqing, a Hydro slot, a Dendro slot, and a Flex slot. First of all, the Hydro slot is either again Xingqiu, Yelan, Farina, or Kokomi with their high damage, survivability, or Hydro application, in which Xingqiu might be slightly more comfortable to use due to his higher Hydro application, hence a more consistent Bloom core generation. Again, a healer is required if you use Farina. The best contender for the Dendro slot is undoubtedly Nahita. She has great off-field Dendro application, high personal damage, and EM buff. Other Dendro options like Baiju, Yao Yao, Kole, and DMC are also very usable. Note that if you use these characters instead of Nahita, Keqing triggers more Hyper Blooms than aggravates, so EM is more preferred as attack and crit does not affect transformative reactions. For the flex slot, you could use Fischl as again her personal damage is high due to the abundant Electro related reactions. Also, you could put in another Hydro character to reduce ER requirements. Lastly, Baiju or Yao Yao could fit in as a healer if you are using Nahita. One important thing to note is that the more Hydro application and the slower the Dendro application in the team, the more Hyper Bloom reactions are going to occur instead of applying Quicken, so EM becomes more valuable in these teams. The last team that I'll introduce is an Overload team. The core of this team is Chef Reeves, which gives 40% Pyro and Electro Rest Red and up to 40% attack. You generally want to put her in a team with two other flex slots. Good contenders for the flex slot are Bennett for his healing and massive attack buff, Xiangling and Fischl for the high off-field damage, Maidel for shields, or Sarah for buffs. Note that Overload would knock small enemies backwards, which often make them out of range of attack. This team will be more comfortable against boss enemies or if you could reliably hit enemies against the wall. The rotation of Keqing mainly depends on the playstyle. That is, whether you are playing her as an aggravate DPS, a non-field Electro flyer, or a quick swapper. Also, some minor details would differ depending if you're using Thundering Fury or not. For Aggravate's Keqing using Thundering Fury, you have a more flexible placement of second E in your rotation. Generally, the most optimal rotation is started by pressing E and then immediately pressing Q, and after the Q animation ends, press E again, followed by N1C and N1. This will refresh the cooldown of your E and hence you can press E again. And lastly, you'll do 3 N1Cs and end the rotation. However, you may not be able to hit all 3 N1Cs due to enemies dying, lag, or other reasons like enemies being knocked back, so you can use the second option, which is EQE, followed by N1C and then pressing E 2 times, and at last doing 3 N1Cs. The recasting of E helps you reposition yourself and avoid having to sprint towards enemies. However, if you are using other sets such as Gilded Dreams 4-piece or other 2-piece, you can simply EQE into spamming N1C, recasting E if you need more infusion. For a more Electro driver playstyle, the rotation is about the same as the Aggravate one. However, note that if you're using Xingqiu or Elan, as you cannot normal attack in the Q animation, using Kill on Keqing actually loses overall damage due to less reactions. Hence you can first cast and immediately recast E, and followed by 3 N1Cs, and repeat this process once, entirely skipping the Q. Similarly, if you are not using Thundering Fury, the rotation is also similar to the Aggravate one without Thundering Fury, which is simply casting and recasting E into spamming N1C. For Quick Swap Keqing, you will not use Thundering Fury and your rotation should just be EQE into spamming N1C until your buffs run out. So if you just want an idea on how Keqing can be built and integrated into different teams, then you are free to click off, as now I will talk about some additional details regarding Aggravate's Keqing. The debate between C0 Kazuha and C6 Sucrose has been a long debate for years, but in the Keqing team the difference is negligible. I have ran calculations on C6 Sucrose and C0 Kazuha on my build and another top ranking Keqing build, and it turns out that Keqing with C6 Sucrose on Sacrificial Fragments beat the same build with C0 Kazuha on Zyphel's Moonlight by around 15 to 25k damage on Keqing per rotation. However, there are a few things to notice. Firstly, the raw difference between Kazuha and Sucrose decreases the more EM you have on Keqing. Secondly, EM buffing sets like Instructor and EM buffing characters such as Nahida hugely diminishes the difference between them, in some cases even giving C0 Kazuha the lead. Thirdly, Sucrose on filling Tales of Dragon Slayers would require at least 8 total ER rolls on her artifacts depending on the team. However, the difference is again small if Keqing is on EM Sands. At fourth, the damage from Kazuha himself actually offsets the difference between him and C6 Sucrose. That is, his own damage compensates for the difference in damage of Keqing, although the overall team damage is still very close. Additionally, Kazuha's grouping is more comfortable to play with, and he performs very similarly to Sucrose if Visual is using Stringless with EM Sands. It could be seen that both options are very similar. A more interesting and meaningful question to ask is how much EM does she need, and why the stacking EM on her does not work as well as balancing EM and attack. To illustrate this, a concept called diminishing returns must be introduced. Diminishing returns is originally a term in economics but was used by the Genshin community somehow. Anyway, it refers to the fact that the more of a stat you have, the less valuable buffs of said stat is. For example, for a build with 1.5k attack, a 300 attack buff is a 20% increase, but the same buff applied on the 2.4k attack build is only a 12.5% increase. The more attack you have, the less valuable attack buffs are. This is also why if Keqing is highly invested in and has like 240% plus crit damage in a Keqing Sara team, Sara C6 increases her damage by 60%, so overall this is an average of dealing 1/4 more damage. However, if you use an attack circlet with EM Sands, the buff from Sara offsets the loss of the 62.2 crit damage from the main stat of the circlet, and its 46.6% attack from the circlet might give a higher increase in damage than the original 1/4, as builds with EM Sands typically have low attacks ranging from 1.3 to 1.4k. EM is different from other stats such as attack and crit in the sense that it's used in damage calculation in a fundamentally different way. In simpler terms, the damage increase from 100 to 200 EM is higher than that of 200 EM to 300 EM and so on. In fact, even if you have infinite EM, you'd only get a 500% multiplier in aggravate damage. So the value of EM drops really quickly and you'd not want too much of it. You would typically want to aim for around 250, so if you're using Nahida and Sucrose with Keqing, attack within sands will be noticeably better. This brings me to my next point. The general rule of thumb is that 300 to 400 EM in battle is a good point to stop. However, it's not like EM is completely useless after reaching 300, it's just that it's less valuable. For more concrete numbers to illustrate this, 100 EM increases bonus damage from aggravate by 38%, this increases to 71% at 200 EM and 100% at 300 EM. As you can see, stacking much EM is not necessarily the best option, especially when you are using Nahida or Sucrose, where you will already get at least 150 from them, or maybe even instructor stats on your danger slot, which gives another 120. So if you have EM buffs, attack stance is better, and also if you have no EM buffs, EM stance will be better. Also, note that if you're using Gilded Dreams, attack stance is noticeably better due to the 180 EM from 2-piece and 4-piece. Note that this only applies for catalyzed reactions. Only EM should be built for characters that trigger transformative reactions such as Swirl. Before aggravate, physical Keqing used to be a rather popular option among Keqing players. If you are interested in this team, just know that this team consists of Keqing, a cryo slot and 2 flex slots. The cryo slot is here to trigger Superconduct, which shreds physical resistance. A sample team would be Keqing, Rosaria, Fischl and Bennett without his C6, where Bennett could be replaced by Zhongli, Mika or other character. I placed this team here because the current trend of Abyss enemies and blessings does not favor physical damage over Electro. Also, there's a team where you could use Xianyun and do plunges. Unfortunately, I do not have her, but I'm sure there's some other dedicated videos for this. This team is in this section simply because it is not the most mainstream playstyle of hers. This marks the end of this video. I am truly grateful for the 2 of you that watched this poorly produced video till the end. I hope this covers what you expect to know about from a Keqing video, and I'm more than thankful to receive any constructive criticism, as this is the most serious long video I've ever made. Anyway, I'll go and try to fix my upload schedule.